Okay, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you for coming. Yeah, my mic is on. So today we have Heather. Heather Whiteman runs him, and you saw her bio on the website, but I just wanted to say it again. So we remember who Heather is. She's a citizen of the Apsaalooke Crow Nation. She's the director of the Tribal Justice Clinic and associate clinical professor at the University of Arizona College of Law, where she teaches courses on tribal water rights, tribal courts, and tribal law. Before joining the Arizona Law faculty, Heather worked as an attorney at the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, Colorado, advocating for the rights of Indigenous peoples to water, land, and self-determination, and as an in-house attorney for her tribe, for her own tribe. If there's anything else, Heather, you want to add about your background, that would be wonderful. And with this, I want to thank everybody who's joining us here in person and also online. And Heather has to leave by 1:20, so we're probably going to finish lecture around 12 or 12:10 and have a few minutes for questions. Please, if you're online, mute your mics, and if you have any questions, we will take them at the end, so please leave them in the chat. And with that, I will hand it over to Heather. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Natalia. How do I get back to the power?
I think it's the view. You go to the top view. Just minimize that window. Yeah, minimize the window. Right.
That one? There we go. Gotta put it on the mouse. There we go. Okay. Okay, now I can't see myself and I'm disoriented. Okay. Yeah, so thank you, Natalia. Thank you to your colleagues as well for being here. Thanks for the invitation to come and speak with you all here at the Architecture Planning and Landscape Architecture College. I want to acknowledge before we begin that I'm speaking with you from the ancestral and current homelands of the O'odham and Yaqui people, as well as other Indigenous nations and heritages. I myself am a member of the Apsaalooke Nation of Montana. That's where I grew up, and it's really where I'm still centered from. And a lot of what I talk about comes from my relationship with my own land, my own ancestral land, and current contemporary Indigenous homeland as well. I guess we've already talked a little bit about my background, but I'll just say that I grew up on my reservation, the Crow Reservation in Montana. We're located along the boundaries of the states of Montana and Wyoming in the Bighorn Mountains, in the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains, the Little Bighorn River Valley as it's known today. The place where Custer met his last stand is maybe the most famous mainstream historical site on our contemporary homeland. So that's a little bit of where I am. I am the daughter of a dryland farmer in Montana. I grew up farming and ranching. And my family was one of those who, I guess, were, some would say, assimilated, right? We took on some of those practices, life ways that were forced on us by the US government during the allotment and assimilation policy here in the United States, when our tribe was forced onto a sedentary land base after our previous life way of being nomadic and being a hunter-gatherer society mainly. We took up farming, we took up a sedentary lifestyle. My family actually engaged and figured out how to be more self-sufficient on our land base, but that hasn't given us an easy or straightforward existence necessarily. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those pressures on my family and my people and on tribal nations in the United States in general during our presentation today. So I wanted to just begin with telling you a little bit about what I'm hoping to cover today. We probably won't cover everything. I have a lot of slides. I know I'm not going to talk through all of them, but I wanted to just sort of give you all, as folks in the architecture and planning field, a little bit of background on the legal framework in which tribal water rights or indigenous water rights here in the United States exist, and how the law and those relationships interact in ways that often implicate people in your profession. I wanted to hopefully cover a little bit about the legal history in the United States for how these rights and frameworks have developed, how they currently function, and maybe a little bit of context from the international sphere about how the rest of the world looks at these issues and how that's developing in, I think, more hopeful ways than maybe what we see here in the United States. And then at the end of my presentation, I'd like to just present a couple of ideas about our pathways forward as peoples who will continue to coexist, hopefully, right? And some of the lasting and emerging areas of concern in the sphere of Indigenous peoples and water rights. So I wanted to begin by just giving a little bit of a rundown of the situation with respect to Indigenous peoples and water rights. The current estimate is that around 884 million people globally lack access to safe drinking water, right? In the United States, we only have less than 1% of the population that is documented to lack access to safe drinking water and wastewater disposal. However, at least 13% of American Indians lack access to drinking water and wastewater disposal. Those are shocking disparities. These figures are from 2011. I acknowledge that they're a little bit dated, but I can also tell you that they have not improved since 2011, and they may very well have become more disturbing. This pie chart presents to us the distribution geographically in the United States of homes that lack access to safe drinking water and wastewater disposal. So in our federal domestic legal system, with respect to Native American affairs, the federal government exercises a lot of bureaucratic and administrative authority over tribal nations' land bases for reasons that are too long for me to explain well today. But I will say that, you know, tribal nations and the federal government have a history of treaty making, nation-to-nation relationships over the decades, over the centuries. That has evolved into a nation-to-nation partnership in many cases, where the federal government has what it describes as a trust responsibility to federally recognized Indian tribes. What that means is that they exercise a tremendous amount of bureaucratic and administrative authority for assisting us or helping us begin to administer and govern our lands in a more independent way, in a way that's more consistent with norms of self-determination for nations. That's something that we continue to push towards, and which we often meet a lot of resistance for in our domestic legal context. But each of these colors represents a region, a bureaucratically divided region through which the federal government exercises its relationship with tribal nations in that region. This pie chart shows which regions have the largest percentage of homes without wastewater and drinking water, safe drinking water access. As you can see, the Navajo region, which is where the Navajo Nation is located across a 3-state area, has the largest percentage, at least, 30, probably over a third at this point. Again, this is a figure from 2011, so it's probably a little dated. The Billings area, which is where my tribe is located, has 3%. Alaska, not surprisingly, has an 18% share of those homes lacking access to safe drinking water. And the other regions, if you look at, Navajo and the Arizona region, which is the rest of Arizona, you've got over 40% of homes. So when we think about access to water, access to safe drinking water, and sanitation, basically, then there are some real issues in our region, right? Albuquerque, another 6%, California, another 6%. So the Southwest, if you all are here in Arizona because this is where you want to ultimately do your work, this is something that I think is a really important concern for you. So again, and this is another chart that just kind of shows us homes that lack access to safe water. This was again a chart that was prepared early in the 2000s, and there was a 2015 goal. I can tell you that that goal was not met. We didn't bring our percentage of homes down to 6.9%. These issues are well acknowledged and well documented. So in 2011, the special rapporteur, no, it wasn't 2011. It was 2011. The special rapporteur on the right to safe drinking water and sanitation visited Indian country. She did what's called a country visit. This UN expert did a country visit to the United States and looked specifically at the situation of Indigenous peoples' access to water. This is part of a global study she did, but she came to the United States to look at some of these issues specifically. We have a unique legal system here. Our government has a unique relationship politically with tribal nations that doesn't exist in most parts of the world, in most nation states. So this was an important part of the special rapporteur's study. But she found that the situation here, even with the acknowledgement of political existence of Indigenous nations, wasn't that different from in other parts of the world, and acknowledged that these situations demonstrating lack of access are a direct result of policies and politics which exclude certain segments of the population, and that Indigenous peoples are uniquely and regularly one of those segments of the population in any nation state. So let's talk then a little bit more specifically about the legal framework here in the United States. As I mentioned earlier, the federal government during its earlier policy eras made treaties with Indigenous nations. In around 1870, the federal government repudiated that policy and ended its treaty-making practices and no longer made treaties with Indigenous nations. However, they continued to work through the context of basically contractual relationships and negotiations with Indigenous nations to secure, I guess, continually growing access and dispossess Native nations of their lands and resources through agreements, or sometimes through the issuance of executive orders, through acts of Congress, things of that nature. So we didn't have treaties going forward from around 1870, but we continue to have agreements that often looked very much like treaties. We continue to see the federal government set aside specific blocks of land carved out from much larger territories to establish homelands, permanent homelands for Native peoples. Of course, all of these historical practices led to conflict over lands and resources, over extensive authority from competing governing authorities over lands and resources. And that's a lot of what our legal framework is comprised of, the resolution of those kinds of conflicts. In the early 1900s, we had a duo of cases that set forth a framework through which the rights to lands and pertinent resources like water would be resolved. In the Winans case in 1905, there was a dispute between a non-Indian owner of lands bordering the Columbia River and a group of Native Americans who had a treaty right that ensured them the right to continue to access land even if they had ceded those lands to the US government for the purposes of continuing their hunting, fishing, and subsistence practices. The United States brought suit on behalf of the tribal members against the Winans brothers, who were the non-Indian owners of the riverfront land. The Indians sought to continue their Aboriginal fishing practices at a place where they had always done so for millennia, since time immemorial, right, for thousands upon thousands of years. Who do you think won? We've got these white property owners who are trying to develop a fish wheel on the river to, pull salmon out, can them, develop a great bustling Northwest economy, Pacific Northwest economy. The land is plenty, it gives. It's our job as mankind to make use of what the land gives us. Who do you think won that case? The Indians won, right? They did, yeah. And this was a really important decision because when the Supreme Court looked at that conflict, they looked at the treaty. They looked at the language of the treaty. they looked fairly at what the intent of each party to that treaty intended to secure to themselves through that treaty. Then they said these Indians made a treaty and they specifically reserved the right to continue to visit the places where they knew there would be fish, to protect their lifeway, their subsistence, the thing that was the most important element of their natural world, which was the salmon. They wanted to continue to access salmon, and that was maybe one of the most important considerations of the tribal negotiators of that treaty. So the Supreme Court ruled that they had to protect that and recognize that it continued. So the Indians won that case. The term of the treaty was upheld. It continues to be in force, right? But that's not the end of this story. But we have a couple of important victories in this era, in this early era, that have been really, I think, what's kept us, what has maintained tribal advocacy and tribal nation building efforts in the arena of access to lands and waters. In the winner's case, 3 years later, a similar dispute arose, but a little bit different. Here we had a tribe on a reservation established through executive order for the purpose of bringing a nomadic tribe into a pastoral farming existence on a reservation in the arid highline of Montana. So kind of a high desert atmosphere. And so the United States purpose in that agreement with the tribe that was memorialized through an executive order was to civilize the tribe, to assimilate them to white American life ways and values, and to bring them into a place where they could develop an economy that was consistent with other surrounding communities. Upstream from the reservation, a lot of white farmers were also developing the lands to farm and run an agricultural economy. And they were taking so much water out of the river that there was none left flowing down to the reservation, and the tribe couldn't farm successfully. They needed to irrigate to make beneficial use of their land. And so again, the United States sued the white landowners upstream, the white water diverters upstream, to enjoin them from taking all the water out of the river before it hit the reservation. Who do you think would win that conflict? The Indians won again. Can you believe it?
No.
This is the only law lecture you'll ever go to where I keep telling you victory stories about Indians in conflict with white economic interests, right? But yes, the Indians won in winters. Why? Because the white farmers upstream were thwarting the purpose of the United States. It wasn't really about, we must make sure the Indians maintain their access to vital lands and resources. It was rather based on the rationale of the United States wants the reservation to provide a home, a permanent homeland on which these Indians can take up the benefits of white Christian yeoman farming. So that was kind of what I think drove the court to find in favor of the tribal interest in the winner's case, but it's been a very important case. Just to follow up a little bit on the progression, we also have in 1952, the McCarran Amendment, in which the United States Congress enacted legislation that placed federal water interests under state court jurisdiction. Nothing in the amendment says anything about Indian tribes, but after the McCarran Amendment was passed, it's since been interpreted to apply to tribal reserved water rights. So tribal reserved water rights can be adjudicated by state courts, which is often not ideal for reasons that I don't have time to explain fully, but I'm sure you can imagine, right? We don't want to go to state court often. We often are not significant participants in state political forums, state political processes, and so often state court judges are not well-versed in tribal rights and aren't friendly to us as parties before them. So we would rather usually go to federal court if we can't go to tribal court, right? But the McCarran Amendment has been interpreted to place our claims and claims brought by the federal government on our behalf under state court jurisdiction. And that's a significant factor that I'll talk more about in a minute. The Arizona versus California, another case which involved, the interstate litigation between Arizona and California over the Colorado River. Significant because that case included a holding by the Supreme Court through the special master that all tribes, whether they're a treaty tribe, an executive order tribe, a tribe with a land base recognized by US Congress, we all have the same type of right. Right. So one thing that people were afraid of was that we'd have different classes of tribal rights, especially with something like water, because some tribes have a treaty. That seems to be a pretty important legal context to be able to frame your rights through. But if you don't have a treaty, can you still make the same argument? And Arizona versus California established that yes, all the tribes have the same water right. They all have a reserved water right that is, you know, has a couple of important characteristics. The Winners Doctrine outlines what the nature of a tribal water right is. The Winners Doctrine, that Winners case that we just talked about, the tribe on the high desert of Montana. In resolving that conflict, the Supreme Court made a few really important pronouncements that have developed into what today we call the Winners Doctrine. In establishing an Indian reservation, since Arizona versus California, whether by treaty, executive order, or congressional act, sufficient water was implicitly reserved to fulfill the purposes of the reservation. So when that reservation is established on that date, there is a reservation of enough water to meet the needs of the tribe, present and future. Okay, and that's important because most treaties don't say anything about water. Most of these executive orders establishing a reservation don't mention water specifically, right? So that was an important pronouncement. The priority date is the date of the establishment of the reservation. That's really important because in Western water law, we follow generally what's called the prior appropriation doctrine. The first person to use water has the highest right. People who come later come junior. They may not get their water rights fulfilled if there's a shortage of water available. Okay, and that's really important. So if you think about the time frame during which most Western reservations were established, it's earlier than most of the later water uses, which gives tribes a lot of leverage in water conflicts. We can usually say, well, our right is first. We get our needs met before anybody else does. That's a lot of leverage. Recently, we've had a few different water rights cases come through the federal court system that are of concern, right? You guys probably all heard about the Standing Rock controversy, right? The dispute over the pipeline. One of the main concerns of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in that broad conflict, there were many concerns, but one of the big concerns was the impact potentially of the operation of the pipeline, of any problems in the operation of the pipeline on the water that the tribe depends on, the river that runs along the boundary of the reservation and through its heart, right? So in one of the many cases that emerged from that conflict, there was one suit by the tribe to enjoin the pipeline from, enjoin the Army Corps of Engineers from permitting the pipeline because if it broke, and even by its very presence, it was changing the nature of the water. It was making the water spiritually unpure. And if there were a break in the pipeline, that would be an even more heightened impact on the spiritual pureness of the water. The court in that case ruled against the tribe, holding that, first of all, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe has not quantified or decreed their water right through any pronouncement by a court of law, but also that the water, if there is a right to water, there's nothing there about spiritual purity or suitability for religious practice in a water right. A water right is viewed by most courts as more of an economic property right rather than a relationship with something that sustains you in ways other than, you know, your sheer physical being. And so yeah. Another case of concern is the Hopi tribe versus the United States case, another federal court case that involved the Hopi tribe suing the federal government for failing to assist them in bringing or developing infrastructure to treat water to make it safe to drink and use in their homes. So there's a really, I guess, a problem with the groundwater on Hopi where there's a lot of arsenic in the water. And, you know, the tribe does not have the financial capacity to fully treat and develop a municipal water delivery system where there's treatment and removal of the arsenic to make it fit for human consumption or even most domestic uses outside of consumption. However, the federal court here held that the United States trust responsibility to the Hopi tribe did not give the tribe right any claim against the United States there. There's no violation of the federal government's trust responsibility to the tribe by virtue of naturally occurring pollutants in their groundwater. A couple other cases similar, talk more about those if we have time. So yeah, some of the things, the characteristics of tribal water rights. Despite the difficulties facing over-appropriated water systems, tribal nations still need to protect water interests. We have a lot of competing interests. We have municipal, non-Indian municipal and tribal municipal, industrial, we have conservation values, recreation interests, agriculture. Right here in Arizona, we know about the demands that agriculture places on water. In a lot of other areas of the American West, it's similar. We have energy development, another huge interest, very powerful interest that also has some really significant water implications. So we have a lot of pressure on an increasingly scarce resource, and this underscores the need for tribal nations to be able to assert their rights and have a voice in the different process through which this resource is allocated. And we also need for tribes to really have the benefit of a full seat at the table and the ability to develop water in ways that meet our needs and satisfy human rights concerns for funding to develop these infrastructure projects. So there are a couple ways that that's begun to happen. Two ways of quantifying a tribal water right, in other words, of having a legally recognized interest in a body of water that can be protected from outside incursions, or potentially in some tribes' cases marketed in ways that will meet other economic or governmental needs of the tribe. You need to quantify that right before you can do very much with it, whether you're going to put it to beneficial use or use it for some other purpose or preserve it for future uses. The paths available for tribes to quantify their water rights are adjudication and litigation, which has some merit but has a lot of risks, or settlement, which also has some merit and some significant risks as well. Oops. So some of the risks on litigation involve, at the end of a litigation process, you end up with a decree, but that doesn't bring water onto your land, right? It's just a piece of paper that says you have a right to water. There may not be any funding available for the tribe at the end of litigation to begin to build the infrastructure to develop their water right. So they may be left with a paper water right versus wet water. That's actually something they can put to beneficial use and preserve or develop whatever resource associated with water they want to use it for. The homeland purpose versus PIA. So I didn't talk about this with the case law, but the practicably irrigable acreage standard is usually the measure for quantifying water rights in most areas of the American West. This standard involves a combination of different factors involving arability of soil, slope of lands, climate, all kinds of different factors about what you can do with your water on your land. What is your land good for? What can you grow there? And it's all based on agriculture, right? It's all based on what kind of crop can be grown, how much water does it take? Is it economically viable? That's the practical part of the PIA. So I can say that I have a reservation with good dirt, but we don't have much precipitation. But if you put enough water on it, we could grow rice. But that might cost way more than you can ever market rice as a crop for in an agricultural market. So that's not practical. That's not going to meet the PIA standard. But if I have an arid but nice flat land area that, you know, if you bring 2 or 3 acre feet per year on it, I can grow a crop of potatoes. I can grow alfalfa if you give me 5 to 10 acre feet a year. You know, and then I can market that hay and it makes sense. The numbers add up. I make a profit at the end of the day. That's practical. So then I can make a claim for that acreage to bring whatever amount of water it requires to grow that crop well. That's what will go into my water right. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. But the PI measure works against many tribes. Like I just said, if you have a tribe that's on a reservation with a lot of mountainous areas, there's not going to be a lot of practicably irrigable acres there. If you're in a desert area where you're in sandy clay-based soils where, you know, it takes a lot to make that land arable. Again, you're going to have a much lower PIA number. So it's not fair. And especially when you look at the history of removing tribal nations to lands that were seen as being less desirable for the incoming white homesteaders, you know, that number begins to be problematic and discriminatory and really, really unfair. And finally, you have the unpredictability, you have the time-consuming nature of litigation and the expense of litigation. The average tribal water rights case brought by a tribal nation takes several decades to complete. And so it's a huge burden on a tribe to pursue litigation. Indian lawyers joke that if you have a good tribal water rights case, you can hand it down to your kids, right? I have friends who've done that, or I have mentors who have done that, and their kids are probably my friends, but yeah. Anyhow, it's funny, but it's not funny, right? Settlement. So settlements are intended to be flexible. They're intended to address the needs of communities and provide funding for projects. They require compromise from all of the parties. These are parties who would often otherwise be in court in litigation against each other. Settlements require congressional approval. That's another difficult part of a settlement, is getting it through Congress at the end of the day. Our current political climate is a challenge. These settlements always require funding, so they require appropriations. Appropriations are increasingly difficult to convince, to secure support for, especially in the current political climate. And finally, settlements at the end of the day are intended to promote cooperation as opposed to prolonged conflict. And just for interest, the pictures that I've included in this slide include at the top, that's the execution signing ceremony for my tribe's water rights settlement back in 2000 and I think probably 2010 or 2011. And we have at that table, the governor of Montana closest to us, Secretary of Interior Ken Salazar in the middle, and our tribal chairman, Cedric Black Eagle, in the war bonnet, the feathered bonnet at the far end of the table, with his wife, who he fondly called the First Lady behind him, as well as our tribal secretary then standing as well. So yeah, that's an example of the nation-to-nation context in which these settlements are executed. Below that, I have included a picture of some of the water infrastructure built pursuant to the Gila River's Water Rights Settlement, the Southern Arizona Water Rights Settlement Act. The Gila River tribe, you probably, if you watch the news or if you read up on any of these issues, you know, they're really at the forefront of a lot of really important practices in water conservation here in this region. They have utilized their settlement and built on it in ways that I think really set a strong example for everyone else in Indian country, maybe everyone else in the region, not just Indians, for how to manage water resources, how to think about water in a longer term framework. And, you know, just always doing something new and innovative and, you know, also making a lot of difficult decisions that are good for the surrounding communities as well as themselves, right? And oftentimes better for their surrounding communities maybe than themselves in the short term. But these are seen as long-term priorities. Making sure that we have water to meet our needs for everybody is a long-term priority. Sacrificing the beneficial use of some proportion of their water right and allowing cities of Chandler or cities of Mesa to sort of come to Jesus over the course of a number of years and begin to implement important water conservation initiatives, and to be able to afford to do that has been something that the Gila River Indian community has really, I think, been a leader in, you know. So being a good neighbor, right? And thinking about ways in which we can administer a resource without hurting each other, even when it's a really difficult and frightening situation when it comes to the long-term viability of that resource. So encouraging good practices and being a good neighbor. I think the Gila River Indian community is really noteworthy in that respect. And then at the bottom, I have a picture of Fort Laramie where many of the tribes in the Northern Plains signed their most important treaties with the federal government. So settlements can give tribes an opportunity to establish water development initiatives and projects that can be important sources of employment, right? Many tribes have begun to look at water marketing initiatives as a way to utilize their water to find economic benefit that will enable them to then utilize that economic benefit to build water infrastructure that will enable them to later use their water rights more fully in the future. Many tribes have prioritized protecting habitats for tribal fisheries, protecting or restoring wetlands. Another thing Gila River is doing, right? Restoring the Gila River, the waterway, the wetlands that used to exist there. Many of them are being rebuilt and reestablished. Delivering really important financial resources for tribal and other local infrastructure development and water banking. Water banking is something that I think we'll see more and more of, especially here in the Southwest. Settlements, however, involve concessions, and sometimes those are politically difficult for tribal leaders. Sometimes they're politically difficult for non-tribal leaders, right? Some of the concessions that are made. Just wanted to mention groundwater. I think groundwater, most of the appropriative systems that I've talked about are really about surface water, but groundwater is becoming a more and more important concern and consideration. Does it make sense that in most parts of the United States, we administer groundwater completely separately from surface water? No, it doesn't make sense, right? In many places, they're hydrologically connected in ways that administering them separately is really legal fiction. And you guys as planners probably know this, or as people in the field of designing the systems through which we administer resources, right? But in a lot of areas of the American West, much of our water is groundwater. There's in many places a dearth of surface water, and we have vast aquifers that are being over-appropriated and overused and expended at really alarming rates that I don't think people fully understand. So in 2013, the Agua Caliente Band of Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla Indians sued the Coachella Valley Water District and the Desert Water Agency. The Agua Caliente tribe is in Palm Springs, right there in the Coachella Valley, and they sit over some of the most pristine groundwater in the desert Southwest, in the arid Southwest. And they're also in the middle of Palm Springs. And what do we have in Palm Springs or in the Coachella Valley? What have we got? We've got a lot of golf courses, and that's the first thing people point their fingers at when they're talking about wasting water. But the other thing we have is a huge agricultural community that uses a large volume of water and pumps a ton of groundwater. And the subsidence in the surface of the land is well documented. So the groundwater was a concern for Agua Caliente. They wanted to establish their reserve right, their winter's right to groundwater, right? But that wasn't something that the courts had ruled on before. All of these cases are about surface water. So Agua Caliente, and just to make a long story short, in 2017, scored a major victory in first the Eastern District of California, and later before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, recognizing that their winter's rights extended to groundwater. And the court's rationale there was, well, we had a reservation established and there's no surface water at all, right? There's some runoff intermittently during the year, but you can't tell me that the federal government set aside this land for these Indians and intended that there was no water right reserved to them. And if there's water underground, that's what was reserved. So that was a really important case, recognizing that the right extends to groundwater. Really important, especially here in the Southwest. Another important part of what the Winters Doctrine has been applied to is, sort of increasing recognition that if you have a water right, it needs to be water that's suitable, right? So water of a certain quality. Is there a quality component to a winter's right? We don't have a clear ruling on that yet, but we have a couple of important cases that recognize that that should be part of a reserved water right. Haven't quite gotten that and clearly enunciated. Many settlements, this is one of the benefits of settlement, you can resolve some of those types of questions without having to rely on a judge who may not know anything about water, may not know anything about Indians, may not know anything about farming. You can resolve some of those issues through settlements, and you're not going through the uncertainty of what a federal court judge is going to decide. So just the quantity quality nexus. Some of the ways in which tribes are increasingly able to preserve quality include federal statutes like the Clean Water Act, which provides for treatment as a state authority for tribes, congressional initiative that gives tribes the same right as any state government to set water quality standards and enforce them, often even impacting the ability of upstream users to engage in really economically important activities. In 1996, the 10th Circuit upheld the right of the Isla de Pueblo in Albuquerque to keep the city of Albuquerque from discharging effluent into the Rio Grande River. And this was, it required the city of Albuquerque to change its wastewater infrastructure in really, really significant ways. But the right of the Pueblo to set that water quality standard was upheld. The United Nations has begun to recognize the human right to water. And I'm just going to go through this really quickly. But in 1999, we had the first statement from the United Nations that the right to clean food and clean water are fundamental human rights. And they've developed that right a little bit more over the decades since then. In 2007, the United Nations issued the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in which many rights were contextualized to apply to Indigenous peoples, and the right to water is arguably within that document. It was adopted by the UN in September 2007. The United States voted against it, affirmatively against it, right? We had a handful of states that abstained from voting, but we had what we call the Kansas states, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, who all voted against the declaration. They were the only states that voted against it, right? Why do you think that is?
They need to pay for the infrastructure.
Well, anybody's going to need to pay for infrastructure. Yeah. But if we think about those 5 states, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, well, 4 states, what do they have in common? They're former colonies of Great Britain, right? They all have that Anglo legal heritage. They all have significant indigenous populations who were colonized, and in each of those places, nearly replaced by white colonist populations, right? Canada, New Zealand, Australia, United States. There are arguably indigenous peoples in every member state of the UN, but those 4 states have that in common, that they have supplanted indigeneity in the lands in which they assert their sovereignty today. So the United States was among the nations that did not support the UN Declaration. However, in 2010, President Obama formally changed the United States position on the declaration with an explanation that is 10 or 12 pages long about what that means in the United States legal context. So it's not a full endorsement. But yeah, some of the important things, I think Article 26 is key, recognizing that Indigenous peoples have the rights to lands, territories, and resources. That includes water. And there's several. But yeah, here in Arizona, we have a number of tribes with adjudicated water claims, but we have a lot that don't have adjudicated claims. So in the Arizona versus California litigation, there were 4 tribes with the holding by the court, recognizing the right to water and the priority date associated with it. This is just a map of the state adjudications that are in process and a list of tribes here that have water right settlements. 3 of these are partial settlements. TO, San Carlos, and Wallapai all have partial settlements. But as you can see, that's, 10 out of 22, well, 21. And these are the tribes that have yet to resolve their water rights claims here just in Arizona. So just to wrap up, I wanted to make sure that we think a little bit about where we are right now, right? So we have indications that climate change is projected to change the availability of freshwater resources, especially in this region, right? There's increasing competition for access to water to secure long-term access and rights and priority to water. We know that we'll continue to see our relationships with water challenged in ways that we may not be able to imagine today. So how do we deal with that? This is a lot of uncertainty. This places a lot of pressure on every system involved in our existence, right? If you think about what it means to be a tribal leader and contemplate what your tribe's water rights should look like, how you prioritize negotiating a settlement, what would that look like, right? If you are the head of a nation, right? Small and challenged though you may be, how do you secure your nation's future to water, your water future? How do you plan around that? What should your priority be? If you don't have secure water, if you're continually operating in a crisis relationship with respect to water security, what does that do to your nation? These are some of the challenges that confront tribal leaders. If your water treatment system is 80 years old and it breaks down every month, what are the implications of that? Well, you have to cancel school. You have to close your hospital. If your schools are closed, what do parents do? They can't secure employment and keep employment, right? So it compromises every aspect of nationhood. Water insecurity is something that it should be like the highest priority for the leader of any nation, right? If you don't have it, you can't function. You can't build an economy. You can't build a government. You can't rebuild your nation after colonization. Okay, so these are some of the issues associated with water rights. So we have a lot of competing interests to deal with. We have a lot of things to plan around, a lot of contingencies to navigate. There are ways in which we're doing that. We're entering into co-management agreements between tribal nations and other stakeholders, sometimes increasingly industry. Finding ways to cooperate, and that can be very difficult, but we increasingly realize that these are things we have to do, right? We have to figure these things out. Pushing for the ways in which we can build pathways towards true self-determination for Indigenous water futures, and continuing to educate about sustainability initiatives. How do we bring professionals from your fields to work for tribal nations or to work with us to, keep these values paramount maybe as a professional obligation going forward. And finally, we participate, we advocate, and we forge alliances wherever possible. Okay, so I think I have time for 0 questions, but I'll take 2 before I go.
Do you want to take one in person and one online?
Yeah, let's do that. Yes.
Thank you so much, Heather. This is very impressive, very, very powerful. So just you mentioned our college, we focus a lot on the built environment, water that is part of that. If we want to engage with your, how we get started, who will be the contact person? Are there any projects or immediate needs we can think of, maybe strategize something?
Yeah, I don't know of any offhand. I think being educated on issues, informing yourself about, some of the science involved in continuing to advocate for science, and, understanding that I guess I'll just say, full disclosure, I worked for the Agua Caliente in the groundwater case. I was part of the legal team, and today I serve on their water board, their water authority board. And one of our most important tribal departments at Agua Caliente is the planning department, right? The planning department is key to, figuring out how does the tribe plan a water future? How does the tribe interrelate with the city of Palm Springs and talk about water delivery systems that already exist on and around their lands? And where does development make sense and where does cooperation make sense, right? So I think being a good professional and always recognizing relationships and power dynamics is really key.
Okay.
Do we have any online questions? From an economic standpoint, what factors hinder the raise of capital for water resource management and infrastructure? What factors hinder? Probably politics. So from the tribal standpoint, these settlements are usually funded by Congress, by the federal government, right? These are federal appropriations. We have to go through Congress because water resources are a trust asset, and any settlement of them, any disposition of them has to be approved by Congress. So that's part of why they're going through Congress, but they also generally involve an appropriation. This is a settlement of a potential claim against the United States, right? And if we're settling our case, the United States needs to compensate us for that settlement. We're saving them trouble. We're probably conceding something as far as a legal right. And that involves, we can put a dollar value on it. Some people are offended by that, and I can understand why. But at the end of the day, we're taking this to Congress because they are going to fund something that's going to make our lives better. So the real factor hindering capital availability is usually political. Until a couple decades ago, Indian water right settlements weren't viewed, or they weren't under congressional rules treated as earmarks. They are now, so they're an earmark. You have to have offsets for any federal spending on these settlements. That's politically difficult, right? Getting an earmark and having an offset. In other words, you have to pay for anything under congressional rules, the pay-go rule. You have to eliminate something else to pay for this new expenditure. I know there's a lot of talk right now about waste in federal spending, but you know, in this context, it's been really frustrating because people are not very loose with the purse strings. We have to justify every dollar. We go through exhaustive discussions with the Office of Management and Budget about the merits of any expenditure of federal funding for tribal water infrastructure. We have to justify that. We have to do a ton of engineering studies. We have to document the utility, the economic viability of every portion of the water infrastructure that we're seeking to fund through Indian water rights settlements. So I think it's very well studied every time a settlement gets through Congress and gets funding. People have looked really hard at whether they're at their merits. Right. All right, well, I have to run, but thank you all for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
So much, President. Your time.
Yeah, thank you.